Water My Soul, O Lord, Bible Journaling with Fran. As I was reading Psalms 43, I noticed that here we see that David was pleading for God's help in a time of crisis. In the middle of his crisis, David knew that he must cry out to God, and that God would hear his prayer, and that if he didn't have God, he would be lost. He knew that without God, he wouldn't have anything. David's prayer was a real plea to a real God that would answer, hear, and help. He said, "Give ear to my supplications." He said, "Hear my prayer." David appealed to the faithfulness and righteousness of God in his request. In other words, he asked God to act consistently with those attributes and to answer David. He asked God to act according to his character. Enter not into judgment. He was asking God to deal with him on the basis of mercy. David knew God was righteous and that David was far from that. In verses 3 and 4, you can see that David knew suffering. Here David spoke of the persecution and suffering of his soul. David ached and cried to God. He felt crushed to the ground. He felt like he lived in darkness. He felt like his spirit was overwhelmed. He felt his heart in distress. In the moment, in verse 5, he started remembering the past. David started remembering the times of joy. He was thinking of the great things God has done for him. He was in deep thought. In verse 6, when he stretched forth his hand to God, almost like he had hope that God would take his hands and draw him close. This posture of prayer is a posture of praise and hope unto God. David's ache in his soul drove David to pray and praise God. His soul longed for God. He wanted God to water his soul and to fill him. In verse 7, we could see that David felt that his failing spirit could not last long without God's answer and intervention. I'm sure at one point we all have felt like David did, feeling an urgency to hear from God, to hear an answer. He was pleading for God to reach out to him. In verse 8, David was asking God to help him hear God's loving guidance. He was wondering if God was speaking and maybe he had failed to hear. This is an important prayer for us to pray at times. Sometimes we get so caught up in our problems that we fail to hear what God is trying to say. David also said, "Cause me to hear the way I should walk." David didn't know the way. He needed God to cause him to know the way. David said, "I lift up my soul unto thee." He was depending and trusting fully on God. In verse 9, David was asking God for deliverance from wicked men. If you go back to verse 3, we can see that those enemies had persecuted his soul. He prayed not only for God's encouragement, but also for his defense against these enemies. David said, "In you I take shelter." This here was a beautiful statement of faith. David did not shelter in sinful pleasures or in the distractions of the world. He did not shelter in self-reliance, in bitterness, or vengeance. Instead, his shelter was in the Lord. When we find ourselves in similar situations, our shelter should be the Lord and not the world. In verse 10, David felt the need to do God's good will. He wanted God to teach him to do his will. He wanted God to lead him to the land of uprightness. David said, "For you are my God." Always remember that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will teach a willing servant to do his will. In verses 11 to 12, David felt the need for revival and rescue. In other words, David said, "Revive me, O Lord, for your name's sake." A concern for the sake of God's name is a necessary aspect for true revival. David then said, "For your righteousness' sake, bring my soul out of trouble." He was praying for God to destroy all those who afflict his soul. David was leaving vengeance to God against those who persecuted his soul. In the end, David asked God to deal with his enemies, but before that, he asked God to deal with him. He knew that his walk with God was in greater danger than any enemy. We must always ask God to do a work with our spiritual lives first, and then God will take care of the rest. We must always humble ourselves unto God in every situation. We need to serve Him in the good and in the bad times, because at the end of the day, God is still God. No matter where you are in life, He remains God, and we must praise Him. Thanks for watching!